Welcome to Philosophy in a Nutshell, our ever-living tangent to Classics Unraveled that follows the track and continuity of classical philosophy. Today, we're going to follow that track both east and west as we enter the medieval period of philosophy. It is a small miracle that Western philosophy as we know it survived to the present day, given that, in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, so many of the critical works of Plato and Aristotle were either hidden or lost. However, whether they were tucked away in some Western monastery or found in the smoldering ruins of some Eastern city, the Western canon was preserved by an unlikely pair of collaborators, that being the monastic Christian West and the Islamic East. We shall start with the latter because it is in the Muslim East where we see the continuation and development of the Aristotelian tradition. Now, that may surprise some of our viewers, especially if you think of the early Islamic period as one of essentially unending conquest. However, as the borders of that warfront continue to expand westward and eastward, the homeland of Islam, the center of that world, was now far away from the realm of war and was experiencing a long period of uninterrupted peace and erudition. And it's in that context where Aristotle thrived. Now, by thrived, I do mean developed, evolved, changed. And those changes might be positive or negative. So we're going to have to pay attention to how the Islamic version of Aristotelianism is received when it comes flowing back into the Christian West. Perhaps most famously, it was an institutional change that Aristotle brought to the Islamic world. By the time that the center of Islam had moved from its home in Arabia to Persia, places like the House of Learning, a great center of philosophy, but also medicine, astronomy, and the sciences, became a bastion for the academic world, both of the Islamic world and beyond. And much of the science and culture we think of as squarely medieval or Renaissance actually develop and begin there in Persia, spreading eastward back into the West as a result of the Crusades and, of course, the Renaissance. Whether that's astronomical discoveries or medicinal innovations or even cultural or literary tropes, things like chivalry or knightly quests find their antecedents in the poetry and literature of Islamic Persia. However, we are here to talk about philosophy, and we cannot talk about philosophy without philosophers. Let us turn to the first of those eminent minds, a fellow named Avicenna. Avicenna is best known to us for his work, The Book of Medicine, which, in addition to talking about medicine, talks about natural philosophy in general, horticulture, geography, the sciences, astronomy, and so forth. But it is also a work of metaphysics, of philosophy proper, and it's in this book that we see Avicenna trying to apply Aristotelian terms and words to Islamic thought. Avicenna was very interested in Aristotle's distinction between essence and substance. Essence being what makes a thing what it is, and substance, which is the physical or formal properties that make it real, that make it exist. Avicenna's evolution of this idea is to back off from substance, to back off from the formal and material causes of things, and instead focus on essence and existence. This is a somewhat more ephemeral distinction. Essence would be what a thing is, and existence is that a thing is. In other words, that I am me is a description of my essence, but that I am, as opposed to am not, is a description of my existence. By thinking along these lines, Avicenna is going to really focus on the necessary and contingent features of reality. Those things that exist in and of themselves, they are necessary, or those things that depend on other things, contingent. Avicenna says that essence, what makes us what we are, what makes things what they are, is necessary. That it doesn't depend, it isn't contingent on other things. I understand what a man is, but my understanding what a man is does not require that man exists. But to exist, a thing needs to have its essence. An essenceless thing, a thing that is not anything, cannot exist by definition. And so essence is necessary and existence is contingent. It depends on essence. So if essence doesn't exist on its own, and existence is contingent and it requires something else, we need some third thing. We need some third imparter of existence, something that makes existence happen. That third thing, that creator, if you will, is a pretty good supposition for God. Avicenna doesn't give it any essential qualities. He doesn't give it a personality or an intellect, but he says that a creator of existence is necessary in a world defined by essence and existence. Not only does this connect us back to Aristotle's first mover, that original cause in the infinite chain of cause and effect, but it also brings us into one of the first proofs of God, a big fad in the medieval period of using the rational intellect to demand the necessity of a divine creator. While the most famous of these proofs of God emerge out of the Western Christian tradition, some of their earliest stirrings are in the Muslim East, and Avicenna's proof of the truthful is perhaps the most influential. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure why it's called the proof of the truthful. It's an odd name based on what I'm about to describe. Here goes. So, as we discussed, everything is either necessary or contingent. Either it exists on its own, or it has to be caused by something else. Let's take everything that is contingent and put it into a single set, into a single box, right? Everything that is contingent needs a cause. And so, what is the nature of the cause of all contingent things? Well, that thing has to be either necessary or contingent too. But if we put a contingent object up here as the creator of all other contingent things, well, didn't we just say that this box contains all contingent things? Therefore, that contingent object needs to be put here along with the others, and we need to find a cause of all of our C's plus that other C. If that cause is contingent, well, it needs to go in the same box, and another one, and theoretically, any contingent cause needs to go into our box of contingencies. So, in order to avoid an infinite regression, all of our contingencies need a necessary, uncreated cause. According to Avicenna, that is God. Now that we acknowledge a necessary, uncreated cause of all contingent things, let us consider whether man exists as well. That might seem unnecessary. The existence of man seems fairly obvious on the face of things, but it's at this time in the history of philosophy where we become concerned with describing the necessity of things. We've just defined the necessity of God by Avicenna's terms. So what are Avicenna's terms for the necessity of man? Avicenna poses us this question in the Falling Man experiment, which I'm thankful to say does not involve any actual experimentation. Imagine, if you will, a man falling through an infinite void. There is no air, there is no material, there is nothing for him to see or hear or feel. Even his limbs and his body are completely deprived of sense. If someone is incapable of any sense experience, if one is incapable of receiving any external stimulus, then how is he able to count on the reality, on the necessity of anything at all? Even in this situation, a man may still think. And if he can think, he can reflect on his own existence. He can reflect on his own ability to think. In other words, one can recognize oneself, one's essence, even without any sensory experience of one's existence. Not only does this mean that man, as defined as man, is an essential as opposed to contingent thing, but it means that the definition of man, what makes man man, has nothing to do with their body. The essential character of man is fundamentally spiritual and mental. This discovery of a spiritual character of man that is essential in a way that the body isn't is Avicenna's case for the human soul, and therefore for the human being. This is, of course, a fairly obvious conclusion, and so Avicenna ends this commentary by saying, this he knows, and this he should understand intuitively. If it is that he is ignorant of it, he needs to be beaten with a stick. Avicenna's book and his thoughts are very popular in the Christian West, and it's here that we see the beginning of a meeting of the minds between the two sides of the Aristotelian world. It seems like a bridge is being built between these two unlike worlds. but that bridge eventually falls after the First Crusade and the Christian and Muslim worlds become bitter foes. It is in this context that Averroes arises a century later, and now that his audience, both Muslim and Christian, is far more hostile to the cross-pollination of these two worlds, that Averroes ends up taking more aggressive and more controversial stances. Born in Andalusia, which is Muslim Spain, perhaps the most bitter point of contention in the Christian-Muslim split, Averroes was a scholar and a jurist of Islamic law. His interest in the intellect and his interest in not God, not man, but in nature, drives him to some conclusions that are so antithetical to both Muslim teaching and Christian teaching that his name and Averroism become synonymous in the Christian world with atheism. As far as the intellect, he begins his teaching by saying there are two intellects. There is our material intellect, you could say our physical brain, the physical instrument by which we have sense experience and individual rational thought. And then there's our spiritual intellect, again, the supernatural or metaphysical principle by which we understand and comprehend immaterial things. By splitting the material intellect from the spiritual intellect, Averroes suggests that our material mind is merely the specific version, the particular version, of which the spiritual intellect is a shared formal whole. This should ring a bell if you remember the Stoic idea of a shared will, that willpower is the only thing that we have that distinguishes us from any other material entity. That having a will, or rather participating in the singular will, gives us that spark of humanity, that spark of spirit. We also see a bit of that Parmenidean unity, right? That participation in a single featureless whole by a bunch of individual featured creatures. At length, Averroes abandons the material intellect entirely. He simply says that that is so unlike the spiritual intellect that they might as well not even use the same word, and therefore the spiritual intellect is the only intellect worth considering, really. You can imagine how a Christian thinker or a Muslim thinker might hesitate with the idea that we have only one thinking principle, that your thinking principle and my thinking principle, our spiritual intellect, is actually a single entity. But whereas the Christian response to Stoic unity of the will ends up being a sort of nod towards the divine, the Christians take the Averroean idea of a unified intellect in the opposite direction. Averroes' specific formula for the sharing of a single intellect suggests to the Christian mind not that we are participating in something formal and divine, but rather that intellect itself is a merely democratic process, something that is human, fundamentally speaking. Therefore, Averroes' formula for a single shared spiritual intellect is one that makes God on our level, as opposed to man on God's level. It is on this conclusion that the Christian world largely rejects Averroes and his philosophy, earning its probably strongest opposition from the famous Thomas Aquinas, which we'll talk about later. Equally controversial is Averroes' suggestion that the universe, the world, has no beginning and no end. This has precedent. Aristotle suggested something like this himself, but for Averroes, someone already laboring under the reputation of godlessness, to suggest that the world does not require a creator requires him to do a little bit of gymnastics. So, while the suggestion on Averroes' part that the world has no beginning or end is derived directly from Aristotle, his justification of this suggestion is largely theological. He turns to various excerpts from the Quran that suggest something similar to those waters in Genesis over which God passes before the creation of the world. Certain references that suggest there is some material entity prior to God's act of creation, and says this gives us the evidence of a substratum, of some kind of material foundation on which God fashioned the world, that an eternal existence of the world in some inchoate, incoherent form is not a denial of creation as we know it, creation as it was shaped by a divine creator. His explanation, written in the charmingly named Incoherence of the Incoherence, is that God's act of creation is not one of bringing something from nothing, but rather bringing variety out of unity, of taking that Parmenidean one and turning it into something else. Let us rewind to the 11th century, where Anselm of Canterbury, a Benedictine monk and eventually the Bishop of Canterbury, is considered the founder of what we call scholasticism. If philosophy so far has been either experimentation on the part of those early pre-Socratic or very rigorous and precise arguments in the form of Plato and Aristotle, scholasticism is best described as a brute force attack. Let's answer a question by addressing every possible angle. Let us answer it as many ways as we can, think of every possible rebuttal to those answers, and then answer those rebuttals as well. The highlight of scholasticism is its extraordinary thoroughness, the great volume of thought dedicated to fundamental questions. Among Anselm's works, perhaps the two most noteworthy are the Proslogion and the Cur Deus Homo. The first of these, the Proslogion, is a fairly full explanation of certain chief Christian principles, and is unique because, compared to many of his predecessors, he relies entirely on logic and does not refer directly to Scripture as the justification for any of his propositions. The second of these, the Cur Deus Homo, or Why Was God a Man, is a more targeted exploration of why God's humanity, why the incarnation was a necessary part of the sacrificial act. What was it about becoming man that made his sacrifice on the cross effective? It's in the Proslogion that we get the ontological proof of God, another one of these proofs attempting to justify by logic alone the necessity of the divine. Anselm says that we can think of many different beings, some of them greater, some of them lesser. Of all of these beings, necessarily one of them has to be the greatest. Well, what would the greatest conceivable being be like? According to Anselm, the trait of existence, in other words, the trait of being, is better than the trait of non-being. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being, by definition, exists. And therefore, we can accept the existence of the greatest possible being. You may wonder if this ontological proof of God was well received in the Middle Ages, and the answer is no, it was not. He received almost immediate pushback from his fellow monks and fellow scholars, and he was forced to issue a rebuttal. This responsio walks back to merely claiming that there must be a greatest possible being, and that this greatest possible being is God. This argument, this reduced ontological proof, ends up being word for word repeated by Thomas Aquinas when he provides his own list of ontological proofs. Now, at this point in history, the most popular theory of atonement is probably the ransom theory of atonement. This suggests that Satan has in fact ransomed humanity against God. In other words, man is enslaved, and God must somehow pay Satan some distinct price in order for man to be freed. That price is God himself, and therefore it is the death of God on the cross that pays for man's freedom. Anselm does not like the ransom theory of atonement because it does not necessitate Christ's humanity, merely his sacrifice. Man is distinct from God because it has a relationship with God, and that relationship is either a good one or a bad. Anselm suggests that there is an honor due to God that has been broken as a result of the fall of man. Therefore, God, even a loving and compassionate God, requires some kind of satisfaction for that offense to his honor. According to Anselm, it is by becoming man himself and sacrificing himself that God is capable of paying that satisfaction to himself that man on his own could never do. This makes the debt that Christ must pay something that is distinctly owed to God by humanity, and therefore must be paid by humanity, even if it is God taking human form in order to do so. So if Anselm is the originator of the scholastic method, there is no one, and I do mean no one, who did it quite as well as his successor, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was something like a celebrity in the Western Christian world. He wrote the Summa Theologica, which is just as profound and just as heavy as it sounds. The Summa was an essentially complete compendium of every Christian teaching, along with a rigorous scholastic proof of each point. The breadth of the Summa denies us any easy synopsis of the entire thing, so I will simply describe its formula. Every passage begins with a thesis, a proposition, along with a proof of that proposition. From there, he offers every possible rebuttal that he can think of, an objection to the original proposition. He then provides a number of rebuttals to those rebuttals, counterpositions that allow him to assuage any doubts about the original thesis. Every thesis, therefore, becomes the center of a web of thoughts, both negative and positive, all reaching a single positive conclusion to the original thesis. While these webs of positions and counterpositions, again, deny us any easy synopsis of the whole thing, or even of its major parts, there's one I would like to stop and focus on, because it reflects back on what both the Muslim scholars and the Christian scholars we looked at before tried their hand at, which is proofs of the existence of God. Aquinas gives us several possible proofs, the first of which is the argument from motion. This would be the relatively standard Aristotelian take that everything that is moved has been moved, and therefore every effect has a cause, and that we must either go infinitely backward, recursively, looking for that initial cause, or we must eventually stop and discover that initial cause. If that initial cause exists, it must itself be unmoved, uncreated, uncaused, and that we call God. The second is the argument from cause. If we go back to Aristotle's four causes, remember we have our formal cause, our material cause, our efficient cause, and our final cause. It's that efficient cause that brings something from non-being into being that we're concerned with here. Aquinas says that everything has an efficient cause, but by definition, something cannot be its own efficient cause, because if it did, then it would pre-exist itself, which is impossible. Therefore, efficient causes can be thought of necessarily as a chain from future to past, and that if we follow it all the way to the past, we need to find something that has no efficient cause, something that never went from non-being to being. Once again, we call this God. The third is the argument of contingency. A quick reminder, contingency isn't whether a thing exists or not, but rather whether a thing can exist or not. In other words, something that is necessary has to exist. It always exists. But Aquinas says if everything is contingent, then it means that everything at some point does not exist. But if everything at some point does not exist, it is possible, and it is merely the possibility that worries us, it is possible that there's a point in time where nothing exists. We can't have a universe where nothing existing is possible, because if that's the case, a world of nothing can never become a world of something. And therefore, there needs to be necessarily at least one necessary thing, one thing that never disappears, or it never can disappear, and that we call God. The fourth is the argument of degree. Everything that has a feature or a trait, whether that's heat or truth or goodness, has some degree of that trait. Some things are more hot than others. Some things are more good than others. Well, the standard by which we can define heat or truth or good, you could say the form of that heat or good or truth, is, you could say, perfectly hot, or perfectly true, or perfectly good. And that standard or that form is the means by which, it is the source from which every other thing has that trait. Well, if things exist, well, everything needs to get that existence from some formal source. And that perfect existence, that perfect source of existence, we call God. The fifth and final argument is the teleological argument. A quick reminder, teleological comes from telos. That is Aristotle's fourth of his four causes, the cause of finality, of purpose, the thing to which things are drawn or meant. It's that meant, that intentionality that is key to the final way. Aquinas says that unthinking objects seem to follow relatively simple courses to get to relatively simple goals. A rock falling is going to take the shortest and most direct course to get to the ground. That an unthinking object should take the best possible course to its goal all the time suggests a purpose or an intentionality outside of that object. An archer is responsible for an arrow making its way to its target. Just so, unthinking objects obeying the best possible course must be directed by some author. Therefore, all unintelligent things are guided to their purpose by an intelligent author or cause. And this, once again, we call God. This final way or argument gives us an inkling of something like natural law. Aquinas may be the first since Cicero to suggest that the laws of the world, even if they have a divine author, are consistent, coherent, and most importantly, self-evident. They are something that the natural observer, the human observer, is capable of observing and defining merely using his natural faculties. That makes moral judgments universal, objective, something coherent and grounded beyond mere human intelligence. Human law exists too, but human law is only good insofar as it conforms to that self-evident natural law. However, it is this rational bent of Aquinas that I dare say defines the rest of the Western philosophical tradition, whether that's in the theological Christian tradition or in the rational humanism of the Renaissance. If the early Christian philosophers used their philosophy simply to prove the sufficiency of their faith, this is great, because now the revealed subjective character of Christianity is backed up in equal measure by the rational and rigorous objectivity of philosophy. In the next episode, we shall see the Renaissance explode and turn the world of philosophy upside down. Until then, I do hope you've dropped a like in the like jar, and I do hope that you've subscribed to stay abreast of everything we do. I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.